imprisonment was 1 in 19 for black women, 1 in 45 for Hispanic women, and 1 in 118 for white women. From 20,000 to 2010, the rate of incarceration decreased somewhat for black women and increased for Hispanic and white women. Women are likely to be imprisoned more for drug and property crimes than men, and tend to be more not as violent in prison, which I'll get into later on. Also, with women, there's the specific problem of mothers in prison. Women in state prisons are more likely to have minor children than are men. 64% of mothers in state prisons lived with their children before they were sent to prison. Mothers in prison are more likely than fathers to have children living with grandparents. 1 in 25 women in state prisons and 1 in 33 in federal prisons are pregnant when admitted to prison. And the conditions of these women in prison is not always getting good treatment that they deserve, and sometimes they're even shackled during labor, which means that they're chained up during labor, which makes that whole procedure more complicated and dangerous for the woman. And the majority of children who are born to incarcerated women are immediately separated from their mothers. So those are all issues that need to be addressed. One of the reasons for the rise of women in prisons over the past years is in 1988, Congress added conspiracy to commit a drug offense to the list of crimes receiving a federal mandatory minimum sentence. So no matter how little involved a woman is in that, she's going to face steep sentences, and a lot of women are in prison for drug-related sentences in the United States today that were incarcerated in 1980, primarily as the result of an increase in enforcement of and sentencing under draconian drug laws. Women incarcerated in state facilities for drug-related offenses increased almost 900%. The drug laws, when they began in the 80s and are one of the tools of mass incarceration in this country now for men and for women. More about that later. What did they do? They said, oh, well, we'll just put all the women in the jail and we'll put 2 women in every jail cell because women aren't as much trouble in jail as men. And that's exactly what they did. There are now 2 women in every 6x10 cell over at the Dayton Correctional Institute. The conditions there, you can Google it and look it up in the Dayton Daily News, are not good at all. They've been audited, they've been under investigation now. There's been sexual misconduct by guards and personnel over there towards the women prisoners. There's poor conditions in the facility, leaky roofs, bad food. There's totally inadequate mental health treatment, which is a big problem in women's prisons, where they have unqualified staff doing triage for who gets any mental health care. They had 3 different mental health directors in 1 year at the Dayton Correctional Institute. So the women are not receiving the treatment that they need. The conditions are horrible, and I think the community needs to look into that. And I do have more information and handouts on that. So I don't know, how am I doing time-wise? Any questions while I look? Oh, okay. Okay, so I've done about a half hour. Like I said, I'm just learning about this. If other people want to join me with Dayton's women's rights groups in learning more about what's going on with women in prisons, especially at the Dayton Correctional Institute, meet with me afterwards. And I want to thank the organization sponsoring this for inviting us to speak. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to be talking about immigration, the connection between criminalization of immigrants, mass deportation, and mass incarceration. So first I'm going to start off with a little bit of history on the legislation that has been in place in regards to immigration and mass incarceration. So in the 60s and 70s, we saw a shift from the war on poverty into the war on drugs. So you have a previously segregated society now is desegregated, and so since they couldn't maintain the segregation, they decided that they needed to ramp up on the control and the policing of communities of color. There was like a strong impulse to be punitive, which was actually a reaction to the forced competition with people that they had previously been segregated from. So now you have people coming together and a perception of more competition, so they feel like more of a need to control. And then you start hearing politicians using this tough on crime language to win back white voters post desegregation. Then we go into the 80s and 90s. You have a couple of bills that come out. You have the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, 1988, and then you have the Immigration Act of 1990. So three things kind of came out of these acts. One was a narcotics possession is now grounds for deportation. The language of aggravated felony is now being used in regards to immigrants and immigrants breaking immigration laws. And now you have a connection between the war on drugs, violent crime, and immigration. So all of these kinds of different spheres are coming together around this time. Then you go into the 2000s and you've got the Obama administration. The Obama administration has the highest rate of detention and the most deportations than any other president that we've had. Currently, there have been 2 million deportations, and simultaneously, currently there are about 2 million people incarcerated in this country. So I just want everyone to see the parallels between these two regimes that are occurring at the same time. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security creates what is called ICE, or ICE if you're speaking Spanish, which is the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So now they actually have a body to enforce. This came out in 2003. And that is within the Department of Homeland Security. They created this because now you're hearing the language that immigration is a national security threat. So it needs to be, those immigrants need to be controlled. So you've got ICE, you've got the Department of Homeland Security, and you've got the local police departments all working together now. Because ICE gets federal funding, but their funding is dependent on having a minimum number of immigrants detained at all times. So they have like a quota now. And so they're not going to get their funding unless they got those people in the beds, that quota, whatever that number is. And so this is more motivation for them to find immigrants to detain and to keep the ones who are detained longer. You've got this concept of the jobs that are being taken by them. And them means the dark-skinned other. And recently I saw Michelle Alexander gave like a really wonderful talk about this, so a lot of what I'm using is from her. So she put it really nicely, and she said that there's deliberate political exploitation of the racial divisions during times of perceived economic insecurity. And so if they can kind of let us know that, we're in a recession, and like now everyone's feeling really insecure with their own jobs, and so then they'll use that insecurity that we're feeling to create these divides between us and say, like, you need to get them away because they're stealing your jobs, you're feeling insecure because of that person, and then we start dividing from one another. Once they give you a label, whether that label is you're a felon, or whether that label is you're illegal, or you're an alien, or whatever these labels are, that is now grounds for dehumanization. And as Rosalind was talking this morning, once you get those labels, you actually don't get some of the rights that you would have had without that label. So both the regimes of mass incarceration and mass immigrant detention, they started off as a means of control, but then they realized that these are actually really profitable industries. And so now you've seen this rapid growth in both of these regimes as a profit model. Like now we can make a lot of money off of these things. You even have the private prisons that Rosalind was talking about. They're actually lobbying for longer jail sentences and stricter penalties. So you see the connection between all of these. So the challenge is, the more diverse that this country gets, the temptation will be for us to compete with each other more and more. And so we really have to build strong lines of solidarity between one another so we don't succumb to that. They actually did a study, a global study, and the most punitive countries, the countries with the most harsh penalties, are actually the most diverse countries. And the most compassionate countries are actually the most homogenous, where everyone looks the same. And so they don't feel that need to control and separate and be more punitive with one another. So as you can tell, we're a pretty diverse country, and we're just going to keep getting more and more diverse. So we really have to think about, how are we going to combat the regime? They're going to be trying to control even more and more, so we have to be aware of that. But then even internally within ourselves, how can we combat those feelings of competition that we're bound to start feeling the more diverse that we get? So a couple questions that we need to be asking ourselves as a society. Who belongs? Who's worthy? Who's a citizen? And who's less than a citizen? How can we all feel safe on our streets and also acknowledge the worth and dignity and humanity of those who commit crimes? So, we must embrace a human rights framework in order to remain united and intersectional in our analyses. So, something about today, we have a lot of different groups represented here. In this space, we have the Dayton Women's Alliance, we have groups that are working Stop Mass Incarceration Network, we've got the Ohio Student Association, Greene County Black Lives Matter, we've got college students here. So all of us have our stories that we tell, but how can we be inclusive with the stories that we tell so we include each other's stories as well? So oftentimes in the immigrants' rights movement, we're using this language, families not felons. We got that line from Obama. Well, if I'm going around saying families not felons, then what I'm also saying is people who are labeled a felon, well, it's okay to incarcerate them. I haven't been labeled a felon, so don't incarcerate me. But that's not the answer, right? Because also another thing in the immigrant rights movement is, there's other forms of surveillance that they can put us under so they don't incarcerate us. That is also not ending the problem, Surveillance is still incarceration. Yeah, well, this language that we're getting is coming from the outside, and then we're grabbing onto it because we're all feeling insecure in our positions right now. Whether it's immigrants, whether it's LGBTQ groups, whether, it's...
To keep it illegal, so they can make money off of these people that are coming in.
Sure.
That's why before Obama, there was less, what do you call it? And I'm losing my train of thought. Less deportation. To try to change it, one way you have to follow the law in the first place, especially if you're a black man.
Diverse as a country you get, the more control that there's more energy is going to be coming from the top to try to control us.
And they tried to make
Yeah, and I guess what I'm talking about right now is not what we need to be taking into account legislatively. I'm talking